All right, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the use of enological tannins for the wine industry. Thank you for letting me come and do this today, even though it is a recorded session. It's going to be interesting, and I hope you'll get something out of it, and I will join you all at the end of the presentation, so save your questions for the end. So using enological tannins in the wine industry. I just want to quickly review some of the roles of tannin in winemaking. So tannins are important for protein removal or enzyme deactivation. We know this from tannins just in the history of tannin removal or of tannins. Tanning animal hides. We know that they act with the proteins in the animal hides to help tan the hide and deactivate those proteins. So that's the main role of tannins. In wine, they act for long-term color stability. So they combine and form stable compounds with your anthocyanins to keep them bright and vibrant for long-term rather than falling out of the wine. They're very important for as antioxidants. So this is why your red wines tend to age a little bit better in general because of these antioxidants in the wine. You can also use tannins for removal of off characters. So I'll talk a little bit about that down the line, but it's important for when you have some reduction. They can help remove that. You can use them for masking unripe flavors, so improving your wine aroma, or masking some other off characters as well. We generally think of tannins as adding structure to the wine, providing balance and structure. So you can add some enological tannins to help compensate when the wines are a little bit more bitter or astringent. And then generally when we're looking at tannins, we're looking at enological tannins, it's usually just for consumer or winemaker preference in the wine. So as a winemaker, when you're talking about the use of enological tannins or using exogenous tannin additions, there's a couple different decisions we can make. So the first would be add no tannins. So maybe the grapes have sufficient tannins. Maybe you're just happy with the wine, or maybe it's a philosophical choice, but you don't have to add any tannins, and that's fine. Some people will just use tannins as risk management. So maybe they'll just use it in the case of when there's rot to help control some of that, or control or prevent oxidation in the wine. You might use it to just stabilize your color in case of low color varietals, or also in case of when there's rot or poor quality fruit. You can use tannins just to modify mouthfeel. So if you are barrel aging your wines, you are using tannins. You're using exogenous tannins. We generally know that barrel aging is what helps with mid-palate and bringing about sort of that nice round flavor that we're looking for, or a nice round mouthfeel, I guess, with your wines. You can use tannins just as a masking agent, and actually this is something that's known very well with barrel aging too. A lot of times people will mask poor quality fruit with using barrel aging. You can just use tannins to differentiate your wines from similar products. So I've done a tannin course for a local community college where we've talked about this, and I bring in some exogenous tannins and we play around adding them to wines. And you can take a wine and actually make it different enough by doing some tannin additions where it makes an interesting blending component. And we know this, even with barrel aging, that different barrels provide different structure, different characteristics of the wine that are nice when you're using it in blending. And you can do the same thing just with exogenous tannin additions without barrels, especially when you're using tannins from different wood sources like citrus wood or berry wood. You can add some characteristics that are really interesting that can be used to make add a little bit more complexity to your wines. Or maybe you're going to use your tannin additions for a combination of the above. So risk management and then product differentiation or something like that. So there's really no end to it. And then where do we get tannins for winemaking? In general, with wines, we talk about the tannins coming from the skins and the seeds during wine production and from barrels. Nowadays, we get tannins from exotic wood and other origins. So it starts to get really complex when you're looking through a catalog, either our catalog or competitors' catalog, and looking at all these different tannin sources and reading through them and trying to figure out, okay, well, what, if I'm going to be using a Terra tannin, like what does that do to my wine? So the goal of this presentation is to really help you kind of sort through what's available on the market and help decide which products to use with those goals in mind. Whether it's just masking or adding flavor or antioxidant protection or structure or whatnot. So that's really what I'm hoping to get through with this presentation, and hoping at the end that it helps sort through some of those issues. So in order to do that, usually when you read through a catalog, you might see different classifications of tannins or a couple different words that are thrown out. So we have, a basic, overarching category of tannin. They can be kind of divided into two main groups when we're talking about the chemical structure. One is flavonoid, and flavonoids are also known as condensed tannin. So you'll see a lot of times, this contains condensed tannins from grape skins and seeds or something like that. The other major category of tannin are non-flavonoids. So far pretty easy. Flavonoid, non-flavonoid. I'm going to try and avoid doing as many chicken wire graphs as possible, so we'll keep it at this. And the non-flavonoids are also called hydrolyzable tannins. Okay, so far so good. So looking at our tannin sources again, where do we get tannins? In general, the tannins that are coming from your grape skins and seeds are condensed tannins. And the tannins coming from wood, from your oak, be it staves, chips, powder, barrels, are hydrolyzed tannins. It starts to get a little bit more complicated when we're looking at these exotic sources because they can be hydrolyzed or condensed. And we'll hopefully parse those out as we keep going. So what do we use condensed tannins for? These are the tannins. They're also called proanthocyanidinic. So they're the tannins that react with anthocyanins. So they're very important for color stability. And we know this about winemaking, just in general wine production. How when you extract the tannins, they combine with anthocyanins and help stabilize the color over time, whether or not you add anything to your wine. These are the tannins that are a little bit more reactive with protein, so they're going to be adding structure to your wine. So these are the tannins that they react with your saliva proteins, causing that drying sensation when you drink the wine, or that sort of astringent sensation. Now they can be used for protein removal or enzyme deactivation, but I will caution that it is at a pretty high rate of 20-to-1. So you need quite a bit if you're using them for protein removal, but they are a nice tool to use when you are looking for removing proteins for your wine. And the interaction is independent of temperature and ethanol, so you can actually use it pretty early on in the juice stage to help remove some proteins. And so like in Gruner Veltliner or something that you're going to need a lot of bentonite later on for stability, sometimes adding a little bit of a little bit of tannin early on can remove some of those excess proteins, and you end up using less bentonite in your final wine for stability. Hydrolyzable tannins. So now what do we use hydrolyzable tannins for? So generally when we think of barrel aging, and that they're coming from oak sources, the hydrolyzable tannins are what are giving you that soft mouthfeel and that fuller mid palate. They're also the best tannins for preventing oxidation. So these are our antioxidant tannins, tannin sources. They do combine with protein, but it's much more slowly, and it's less effective once alcohol is present. So we don't really think of them for protein removal, but they do, have that softer mid palate and structure. And now I'm going to get a little bit more complicated than this because these are, again, generalities. And if we're going to dive into the black hole that is tannins in wine, it's important to know just a little bit more of what they do and why it gets a little bit more complicated. So going back just for a second to talk about condensed tannins. So again, remember, condensed tannins are flavonoids, proanthocyanidinic. So these are what are combining with your anthocyanins for color stability. So if we break down these flavonoids into their two main groups, flavanols and flavonols, and I always remember flavanols with an A are what are reacting with your anthocyanins. These are what are in your wine, and these are the most important for winemaking. Flavanols are more in the grape. We worry about them more in the grapes themselves, as markers in the grapes. So flavanols, again, we can divide those chemically into a couple different structures, but really when we break them down into their simplest components, it's these four groups. So catechin, gallocatechin, epicatechin, and epigallocatechin. So those four molecules are what make up these chains of condensed tannins. So they can be in any different combination. You can have short chains, long chains of these different subunits. Now we're unable to categorize the subunits effectively right now, but what we do know about these chains of condensed tannins is that the shorter the chain is, the more bitter and astringent it tastes, and the longer the chain is, the softer it tastes. And we can categorize these. You'll often see mean degree of polymerization, something that's talked about if you do a tannin analysis. So if the mean degree of polymerization, the MDP, is less than 5, it's generally very astringent and bitter and kind of poor quality, and it's not something that you're looking for in a wine. If it's greater than 5, it's generally a little bit more palate friendly. So we want these sort of longer chains to be a little bit more pleasant for wine consumption. Now going back to our talking about these hydrolyzable tannins, so from the wood sources, again, if I do this little map and we talk about non-flavonoids or hydrolyzable tannins and then divide them into their kind of subgroups, the main subgroups are the elagitannins and the gallotannins. The elagitannins are what are coming from our wood, and one of their effects is that they help speed up that condensation of flavanols, so of your condensed tannin. So while the elagitannin itself isn't adding to the structure, it's not, it's getting that soft mouthfeel, but it's really helping to speed up this. So this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Those wood tannins can also combine with ethanol, with some of those flavanols, with thiols and anthocyanins as well. So there is a little bit of that color stability. They do a nice job when you have high ethanol, kind of softening that effect of high alcohol. So sometimes barrel aging can help minimize the effect of alcohol. But yeah, it starts to get complicated. But so, this is as far as I'll go with getting into some of the chemistry, but just realize complicated. We need to do some, it's always good to do bench trials whenever you're doing a tannin addition, because it's difficult to predict how they'll react in a certain wine. Now, I mentioned grape skins and seeds as a natural source of tannin during fermentation. And now I know a lot of people, especially in the north, in this part of the world, like to use grape stems during fermentation, and they'll throw in grape stems. And there's a lot of misconception about what happens when you're fermenting on stems. In general, stems, it's part of the wood source of your grapevines. So we don't talk about the grape stems being condensed tannins. They're generally full of hydrolyzable tannins, and we usually don't want to consider them as a tannin source for increasing tannin. Now I hear a lot of people talking about, well, grape stems help with color stability, especially in low color varietals like Pinot Noir. Now in Burgundy, when they talk about adding grape stems to the fermentation, it's never for the tannin addition. It's not directly involved in color stability, but one thing that grape stems do is they help break up the cap of your fermentation. So you get better contact of the juice with the skins because you don't have such a compact cap. And it also allows for more oxygen to get into the cap. And it allows for lower temperature fermentation. So sometimes you get more fruit character with the stem inclusion. Now I mentioned that it breaks up the cap so you allow more oxygen. And now this is what's helping with your color stability. And this, I promise, is the only chicken wire graph that I'll put up. But this is what an anthocyanin molecule looks like in general. And this is your condensed tannin. So these are two molecules of flavanols, and what's helping them combine is actually an oxygen bridge. So we talk about oxygen being very important, and this is where microoxygenation comes into play with helping with this tannin anthocyanin complex. So the stems do help with color stability, but more in an indirect way. Now I'm going to go just briefly talk about some of these different sources of tannin. So the oak gall tannin, it's been around forever. The source of the oak galls, if you've never seen this on an oak tree, it's from a little insect that injects a substance into the oak tree, either in branches or leaves, that cause these galls to form and where they can lay their eggs. And even in Roman times, they used to harvest this for the gallic acid, and it was important for ink production. Note that it is a colorless powder, so this is a really nice tannin source for when you're doing a white wine fermentation, especially because this is one of the important tannins for oxygen or preventing oxidation. So if there's botrytis present, or if you're just wanting to lower your SO2 use, this is a good tannin source to use. Chestnut wood tannins are another good source of hydrolyzable tannins. So again, another antioxidant tannin. So the gallic acid or ellagic acid that's found in oak is also found in chestnut, but in higher concentrations. So it's a cheaper source of getting ellagic acid. Also want to point out that the TTB limits this use in wine to the wood, and so we don't use the nuts, the chestnuts themselves, if there's worries on the allergy worries with nuts. There isn't any nuts in it. It's actually just the wood itself. Terratannin is another source of hydrolyzable tannins. The wood is an exotic wood, and the tannins actually come from these seed pods. So again, it's pretty easy to harvest and extract. So it's a usually inexpensive source of hydrolyzable tannins. These are actually known to do a good job of removing sulfur off aromas. So if you're having some reduction issues in the wine, using a tannin that's a terratannin source is a good way to help remove some of those off compounds. Quebracho wood is another source of tannins, an exotic wood source. So this it's a wood which usually we associate with hydrolyzable tannin, but this has a unique property of being a great source of condensed tannin. So usually used in color stability, adding early in the fermentation for that color stability, and also for that structure and mouthfeel that you get with condensed tannins. Now it starts to get a little bit more complicated because it's not only where the source of the material that we're getting it from, but also the method of extraction. And we know this if you can remember, if you can think of, instant coffee is also an extracted compound from coffee beans from a natural source. Now, when I was growing up, instant coffee was pretty terrible, but over the years, there's been a lot of advances in how it's extracted and how it's dried to help preserve aromatics in it. So you can actually get pretty good instant coffee these days. Most of the coffee that you get on airplanes now is instant coffee, and it tastes pretty close to the real thing sometimes. So again, the type of solvent that's used can be important. The drying method, so you can freeze dry it versus spray drying it. If you freeze dry, you lose very little aromatic compounds, but it's one of the more expensive ways to do it. If you're getting tannins from different wood sources, toasting the wood ahead of time also can impact the flavors and different aromatic compounds that you get along with the tannins that you're extracting from it. So some of the generalities. So if you're getting, water extraction, it tends to impact the mouthfeel a little bit more. Alcohol extraction tends to impact aromatics, but you can also get some softness and sweetness with it. Low temperature and pressure can also help preserve some of those aromatics and can help lead to a longer shelf life. So sometimes you can keep the tannins on the shelf for up to 5 years. I just wanted to point out that there are price differences in tannin extracts, and usually when you're buying a exogenous tannin or an enological tannin, it's going to be a combination of a lot of these to meet different price points and to meet different goals that you're looking for winemaking. So we do know, good suppliers are going to be looking at different chromatograph fingerprints to make sure that they're getting products that are consistent over time, because these are natural products and it varies over time. And then also doing things like thin layer chromatography to make sure that the composition of your tannin blends is consistent. Now, if we look at, I just want to throw this up there as a little bit of a reminder of what's happening during fermentation to the different phenolic compounds in your wine. So anthocyanin is typically extracted early in the fermentation. So here's like day 1, 2, and 3 is when you get your highest extraction of anthocyanins. Tannins are a little bit more difficult to extract, and usually once the alcohol builds up is when you start getting a better extraction of your tannins. And now over time, these tannins combine with your anthocyanins as they're extracting to get these stable pigment compounds that are going to hold on to your color over time. So without adding any tannins, this is what happens during your fermentation with just the natural tannins in the wine. And when we're looking to add commercial tannins, we're trying to mimic some of this that's happening, or trying to mitigate some other issues that can come up when you're doing extraction during winemaking. So, again, without even looking at adding tannins, we will adapt some of our winemaking to some of the phenolic parameters at harvest. So, if you have rot or anytime poor quality fruit is present, you're not worried about phenolic parameters. You're just looking to get it fermented as quickly as possible. But let's say you have your anthocyanin content and the extractability of the anthocyanins. So if you have high extractability and high anthocyanins, you usually don't need to do a really long pre-fermentation maceration, so your cold soaks. If the anthocyanins are hard to extract, we look at that sort of early stages of fermentation as more important to get the most of your anthocyanins out in the wine. So that's when you start thinking of doing cold soaks or some extended or delaying fermentation to get a little bit more anthocyanin. Seed tannin contribution determines how you're managing your fermentation, so your cap management. In varieties like Pinot that have quite a bit of tannin in their seeds but are hard to extract, you might be doing a little bit more aggressive cap management to try and get some of those seed tannins toward the middle of fermentation. But then let's say you have something like Pinot that you're looking to get those seed tannins, but then the phenolic ripeness, so how ripe those seeds are going to determine how long you do that aggressive treatment and how long you keep the post-fermentation maceration, because you want to prevent extracting some of those greenness. So that's where some of these exogenous tannins can be important. So looking at some of these cases, so let's say you have some fruit that comes in and rot is a big issue. So this lactase is always present, so you're always worried about oxidation. So again, short batting time, and you're going to be adding some tannins at the crusher to help scavenge some of that oxygen and minimize the risk. These are some of the tannins that we have that are high in gallotannin that can help with that. So FT Rouge soft. FT Rouge Berry is an interesting one, especially in this case, because it also can add aromatics that have also been kind of deteriorated from some of the rot that you see in the fruit. And then essential antioxidant, I'll talk about a little bit more, but that's one that is new this year that is important in this case as well. Here's another case. Let's say you have healthy grapes, but they're not very ripe. So in this case, you don't want to do a lot of extraction later in the fermentation because you don't want to get a lot of those excessive green characters and astringency that you might get from underripe seeds. So this is where a combination of tannins might be important. So maybe getting some condensed tannins to help combine with those anthocyanins early on, or some of those hydrolyzable tannins to add fruitiness and astringency during the fermentation. This might be a case, you have perfectly ripe grapes that are high in anthocyanin, high in tannins. And even in this case, so this might be like the ideal California fruit that you're getting in that has really good ripeness. In this case, you can also get some tannins that, or you can also play around with some of your tannin additions. So even adding something like oak chips can help with some color stability and enhancing fruitiness or sweetness to a wine. You can also add some condensed tannin early on to help with your form some of your stable color compounds in the wine. And yeah, adding adding some other tannins that might help with just differentiating your product on the market and helping soften it, depending on what your goals are for the wine. So here might be a case where you have healthy grapes, but they're just really low in anthocyanins, low in color. So adding a condensed tannin can be important to, form stable color compounds with these, and also for adding some structure to the wine as well. And then I just want to finish talking a little bit about white wine production, because we don't normally think about tannins in white wine production, but they can really have a positive impact on mouthfeel. So we know this just from barrel-aged whites, that they get this nice body and roundness. It can help minimize the impact of alcohol by using some of those hydrolyzable tannins. Very important for antioxidant production, especially if you're using low sulfur winemaking. Very important for when there's botrytis present to help bind and some of the lactase and binding some of the catechins that are causing some of this oxidation to keep the wine fresh and fruity. And as I mentioned earlier, you can use them for binding proteins to lower your bentonite usage later on in the wine. It's well known that bentonite can remove some of those fresh and fruity compounds in your wine, especially things like thiols that you work really hard to get during the fermentation. So you can lower your bentonite use by doing a little bit of tannin early on. And then just to mention that we have this new tannin to be aware of for next year. So this is a good one to have whenever there's some rot present on the wine. So it comes from a botanical source that was found to have a really high antioxidant property. And it doesn't add any bitterness or astringency. So there's none of this sort of impact on that structure of the wine. Really important. We think it's going to be really important for using grapes that are compromised from botrytis, and also for anyone that's looking to lower their use of SO2 during fermentation. So be aware of that as it's coming out. And then just final thoughts that this is really complex subject that we're sort of, once you start going into the chemistry of tannins, it turns into this really black hole of information that you can get sucked into. So really, until we know a little bit more about how to link some of those sensory impacts to some of the individual compounds or some of the winery processes, I implore you to do a lot of trials, do bench trials, taste through some of these tannin products. We have a really nice bench trial kit that we can send you that's available, and it's a nice tool to play around with just to see how these impact your wines. And on that note, I will stop here. I think I am joining you again live for question and answer. So thank you so much for your time.